Oranges and Lemons, a short story by Richard Holliday. Read by Elliot Stammers and produced by Jamie Ramaswamy. Featuring music by Mark Morgan. This is a Jamie Rama Productions presentation. January 2013. Storm clouds are gathering fast, eh, hun? Of course, Brian was right. The sky was filling with restless black clouds, and soon they would deluge the entirety of their wet contents onto the squashy, moist soil that the farm found itself in. Scott Whitney couldn't complain, really. A good rainfall was always good for his farm. Water was the root of all life, especially the lives of his acres upon acres of green cotton plants, just on the cusp of shooting up through the soil that gloomy January day after the long winter. It had been merciless, yes, but it was over. "I'll be in a sec, Bri," Scott called to his wife, who stood on the decking at the rear of the house that seemed orphaned in a sea of plants and furrowed fields. The stripes of the ploughed ruts crisscrossed across all 15 acres. "Just taking one more look." A cold wind swept up, and Scott took this as his hint to seek the warm confines of his house, his wife, and his son. They'd always give him comfort and warmth, even if the house couldn't, and it was a definite possibility. It had been a long winter and an even longer autumn. The farm had been through some strife in 3 generations, but right now it was so hard. But the winter again had been endured, and the naive would think that 1985 would be the year that everything changed. Scott wished he could be one of those naive fools, but glancing upstream, he took a hard, long swallow. Great machinations were almost at their climax, and the great metallic monster upstream of a new chemical plant right next door did nothing but fuel Scott's apprehension. But there would be time for that later. For now, Scott's tired belly was also hungry, and it was a hunger he didn't feel like prolonging just to stare downstream at a mass of pipes. Nothing bad would come of it, Scott thought to himself, reiterating what he'd been told countless times before this whole thing started. But that was 1983. 2 years had flown by so quickly and so harshly, he couldn't bear to think about it. Again, food was the answer here, and with heavy, mud-caked boots, Scott Whitney finally succumbed to his ravenous appetite and headed inside. The kitchen area just inside the rear door of the house was messy and cluttered. The Whitneys had little time to be house-proud. This was a working farmhouse, and both farmer and wife were too busy keeping things on an ahead course to worry about trivial matters such as tidying. At any rate, Scott Whitney rather liked the clutter. It made his house a real home, lived in and full of life. Standing by the worn wooden table at one end of the room was his wife, busy scooping ladles of thick winter stew onto plates and placing them onto the table with satisfying clumps. Already seated was Scott and Brian's 11-year-old son, Elliot. Wide, intrepid eyes followed Scott to his seat at the table. "Hey, son," Scott began. "How you doing, champ?" "Great, Dad," Elliot eagerly responded. Good, Scott breathed, his exhaustion reaching crisis point. Brian was way ahead, and a steaming plate of the stew materialized before him. Scott took a fork to his food and ate. It was the first time he'd eaten all day. "I wish you'd not stare at the plant all day," Brian murmured. Scott looked up quizzically. "It's not healthy." Scott put his fork down. "I'm worried, Bri." "What for? You know what they told us. Cheap fertilizer for all, and that's just the start." Scott sighed apprehensively, but before he could speak further, Elliot chimed in. "Yeah, Dad, you can't solve the maze?" The maze? Scott wondered what the kid was on about. But of course, it resonated inside his skull. "Elliot," Scott chuckled insincerely. "Been down that arcade playing Pac-Man again? How many quarters today, son?" Elliot was impregnable, though, and his face took on a tone of complete seriousness. "The ghosts won't get you, Dad. You'll eat the big pills first. Cool blue filled the sky on a crisp morning early in March. For hours, many people had crowded on the fork of the thin vein-like river where it diverged. And now, where grassland and marsh had originally been left undisturbed for years and years, there stood a great metal edifice that towered over the trees that surrounded it. Indeed, the brand new chemical plant, built flat out in a year amongst a hive of industrial activity, was a monster. But such a monster was never described as such. The marketing arm of Transition Corporation had gone to great lengths to portray this new alien addition as nothing but a positive influence on the community, and thus the entire community had turned out to see this great scheme come to fruition. However, Scott Whitney declined to venture up the 5 miles or so to actually be at the plant. The crowds had ruffled him, and he was far too busy working on getting his farm ready to take full advantage of the thawing spring weather and get back to greatness again. Every day he'd watched as towering catalytic converters, distillation towers and mechanical mashers had been assembled into an unearthly but somehow organic mass of pipes and machinations. Warily, he watched over the proceedings from his vantage point. He'd read all that Transition had said, but the proof of the pudding was in the eating. "We promised a few short years ago," said a tinny voice on the little TV set on the kitchen counter, "to bring this state into the 1980s. And now, midway through, we deliver on that promise, and more. We'll take this glorious land through the rest of the 80s, into the 90s, and well into the next century. Prosperity will be our time." Brian huffed at the besuited man on the screen. Transition's CEO, Ashton Kleinman, his greasy hair and rimless spectacles, giving himself a well-earned pat on the back, wouldn't fold the laundry. But again, he continued, on a raised stage that was lined with bunting and ribbons that fluttered in the breeze. On a small wheeled trolley was a beige box with a monitor, a personal computer, and it was with a few ceremonial flicks of the clanky keyboard that the plant was officially brought to life. The applause of the crowd, every dignitary and who's who of the state, from governor to mayors and representatives of the country's leading-edge industries, reverberated flatly in the kitchen as Brienne went about what she did day to day, keeping the Whitney household going. "It's started," Scott called from the veranda at the rear of the farmhouse. Brienne walked out to see. Joining her husband in leaning on the worn wooden railing, she peered north. "What has?" "The future," Scott grunted, peering cautiously and deep down suspiciously at the great stacks and chimneys. The applause was not audible from this distance, but he didn't need to hear that to know that it was the start of something. A few wispy trails of smoke began to rise, clouding in the sky and trailing into the atmosphere from the plant's many little orifices and funnels. The transition had indeed begun.